Welcome everybody to our, I think the first colloquium of the spring semester here. It's my pleasure to introduce our colloquium speaker, Ross Dixon. Ross his LinkedIn page has him listed as an atmospheric scientist and an experimental musician. So we're hoping that a little bit afterwards he'll...
Yeah, you know, I've removed all my instruments from the building, so.
Oh, so we're not going to. So when Ross was a student here, I think there was a banjo, a xylophone, anything else that...
Might have been a pump organ. Yeah.
Pump organ as well. So if you see any of those lurking around, we'll bring them in. Ross got his master's from University of Baltimore, University of Maryland, Baltimore County in 2009, and then came here to work on a PhD. And I remember, I think your first talk when you came here, you had done some stuff looking at weather.
Extratropical transition.
Yes.
And
yeah.
And connections with synoptic meteorology.
Yeah, and it impressed me at that time. He started working on a PhD, and then a couple years in, I had the honor of getting to advise Ross for the rest of his PhD, or co-advise him for the rest of his PhD with Matt Hitchman. He got his PhD here in 2017, looking at the Saharan heat low. And to kind of give you a sense of the breadth of Ross's interests, he began, so his project was looking at the Saharan heat low. He was doing this using aquaplanet simulations on an NSF grant that was focused on ENSO variability. So somehow we managed to fit all that together, and he ended up with a really interesting work looking at uncertainty in the Saharan heat low across the CMIP-6 models. We're going to see a little bit of CMIP-5, that's right, yes, that was a long time ago. From here, he went to CNRM in Météo France, where he was an AMA 2050 postdoc from 2017 to 2019, continuing to look at axisymmetric models, simple models of our general circulation, continuing this line of looking broadly at our climate system. From there, he went to University of Arizona for a year and began looking at precipitation and evapotranspiration.
That was a very strange year.
All right. Okay. And then moved to a faculty position at University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 2021. As many people know, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln has made the terrible decision to eliminate the atmospheric sciences department that Ross is in. And so over the next, we've been in communication over the last few months and talking about how to get students through and future for Ross. And despite that backdrop, it is always a joy to see a former alum in our colloquium series here. So it's great to have you back, Ross, and I look forward to your talk today.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the invite to come out.
Hey, Ross, are you unmuted?
Oh, I think
I'm
so.
not seeing you come through.
Oh, no. The light isn't even on. There we go. The light's green, the light's red, and
The red means the batteries are dead, which is
no.
weird because I changed it on Friday. I'll take this and go ahead and start it.
All right, I'll just be loud. Is that okay? Thank you for the invitation to come out and talk about the research we've been doing, and thanks for all the support in the last several months as we've navigated this challenging time in our department. It's been real frustrating and sad, and the community support has meant everything. So really thank you so much for that. Today, I'd really like to talk to you about some of the work that's being done in my group. We've done a lot of different things, so this is called 2 land atmosphere examples across the central United States.
Is it good now? All right, fantastic.
Sorry about that.
No worries. It's best to catch it now instead of midway through and it
Right.
goes dead and you're like, so let me just jump into this. You all are aware that we live in a changing world. All right, you've seen this plot, this figure from the IPCC probably 1,000 times. Who here has seen the warming stripes, right? Thinking about global temperature change across the last 150-something years. But what I'm really interested in is thinking about regional climate and regional climate change. And you can see that this signal gets a lot noisier. There's a lot more variability when we think about temperature change across the United States for a similar period. And currently, I am in Nebraska, hopefully not for much longer, but there's a lot of variability, right? When we think about climate change, no one has ever said, oh yeah, I felt the entire Earth warm by a certain amount. What we experience is local, right? And so this is what my group is really focused on, is thinking about regional projections of climate. And there's a lot of uncertainty. I've been showing this plot for a long time because Africa, West Africa is one of the regions I'm very interested in. And stippling here from this, this figure from the IPCC AR5 shows regions where models agree on 80% of the direction of precipitation change. You'll notice across the Sahel region, there is not a lot of stippling. And here's what that looks like for CMIP6. Each one of these gray lines is an individual model for that red box region. And we can see that in the future, there is a lot of uncertainty in that projection, right? Some of these models get much wetter, some of them get drier, a lot of them just wiggle around in the middle. If you are a stakeholder, if you are a farmer that is in Burkina Faso or Senegal, you are very interested in understanding where does that uncertainty come from and thinking about how we can reduce it, right? And so this is really the focus of my research group. Our goal is to think about understanding and decreasing uncertainty in regional climate projections. Now, I made this plot for some new faculty development workshop, and I really like it because it really grabs all the things that we're thinking about from West Africa and all of the different dynamics, right, that influence precipitation projections across that region. To now, I'm becoming much more interested in the central United States because there's a lot of opportunities to collaborate and a lot of really good connections that I made being in Nebraska. But thinking about all of these different dynamics, right? All of these different forcings where uncertainty in these projections come from. And as a numerical modeler, I like to think about using models across all sorts of scales of complexity, going all the way from single column simulations to global Earth system models. Well, many of you have seen me put this image up before. When I was here, I did a lot of work thinking about the Saharan heat low and how it was connected to the West African monsoon and the Atlantic ITCZ. I don't want to talk about either of those things today. I figured a bunch of you are probably sick of hearing me talk about that. Some of you are probably even more sick of hearing about aquaplanets from me. Here's a slide from my 935 class in 2012. This is what I presented on. I'm not going to talk at all about aquaplanets. I think I heard a sigh of relief somewhere there in the back. I want to think about central United States, and I want to use land-atmosphere coupling and land-atmosphere processes as the lens for what I want to explore today. I want to think about uncertainty in projections of U.S. precipitation. So here is a plot from Al-Mazuri et al. From 2021. And you'll note that this is the end of the century minus the the historical period for the business as usual SSP 585 simulations from 31 of those CMIP6 models. And you'll note the slashing, the forward slashes are where there are robust changes across the ensemble, and the backward slashes are significant changes, right? And what you'll notice is that here in the central part of the United States, there is a lot of lacking forward and backward slashes, right? There's a lot of uncertainty in that region. High model uncertainty in that projected precipitation across the Great Plains. In the last year and a half, I've been involved in producing the state climate report, and my chapter was on the projections. Many thanks to Dan and several other folks for giving me good advice on what to think about when I was putting that chapter together. But here's the expected precipitation change by mid-century for the state of Nebraska for winter, spring, summer, and fall. And those dots, these are from statistically downscaled CMIP simulations, an ensemble of them of, I believe, 20-something. Those dots indicate regions where 80% of the models agree on the sign of direction of change, right? There's a lot of regions that don't have that stippling. There's a lot of uncertainty, especially when we think about regional projections of precipitation. And so I wanted to start this talk by showing some of my master's. He's my PhD student now. He did a master's with me and is now my PhD student, Emmanuel Aldu, who has really tackled this problem. He's using an ensemble of 28 fully coupled CMIP6 models, thinking about the difference between the historical period and the end of the century in SSP 585. He's looking at Great Plains low-level jet, some atmospheric coupling indices, which we derive from the PI control simulations. So these are simulations which are unforced, right? Hundreds of years of simulation without any sort of external forcing, first 30 years discarded as spin-up, and then looking at what the atmosphere land coupling indices in this region are. I've put those definitions up here. I'll talk a little bit about that more. And he also is using several reanalysis data sets as our observational constraint, okay? And this is what he sees when he looks at summer JJA precipitation change across this ensemble mean. And here we're using the dots here to think about regions where the models agree. We can look at this another way by averaging zonally across this box region. Averaging zonally across these two longitudes. And here's what that looks like. Each of those gray lines is an individual CMIP model. So in the northern Great Plains, right, north of 40 degrees north, most of the models agree that there is drying, but there still is a lot of uncertainty in the magnitude of that drying. We're going to save that problem for another day, all right? What he wants to focus on is the southern Great Plains, where there is uncertainty even in the direction of that precipitation change. Many of these models show a lot of drying. Many of them show an increase in precipitation. And we're going to think about approaching this with a couple of different hypotheses. What might account across the models for this signal, right, for this uncertainty? And of course, large-scale processes is a great place to start. Thinking about SST patterns that drive the large-scale teleconnections and may have some impact on precipitation in that southern Great Plains region. We know that the Great Plains precipitation is influenced by the low-level jet, right? There's been several papers thinking about this. So perhaps there is some uncertainty in how that regional circulation develops. And then finally, we're going to think about local processes. The Great Plains is one of those hotspot regions from Koester et al. In 2004. And so these are the three different hypotheses we're going to test to see if we can explain variability across the models in terms of precipitation change for that region. So let's start with this idea of large-scale teleconnections and that southern Great Plains SGP precipitation change. We've taken our indices for precipitation change in this region and just done a regression across SST change across the entire globe. Regions that are statistically significant are within these black contours here. But you'll note they're very weak, R values of around 0.4. So the key point here is that we have SST changes weakly explaining this intermodal variability in precipitation change, but nothing that really jumps out as really strong, right? Really large regions that may be able to explain this uncertainty. We can do a similar thing where we're going to generate an index for the Great Plains low-level moisture flux following Sala et al. In 2025. Changes in meridional wind and moisture through this box into the Great Plains. And what we note when we regress that across the United States is that we don't see really strong signals, really strong correlations within that southern Great Plains box. Really no strong, significant relationship between that change in that Great Plains low-level moisture flux and southern Great Plains precipitation. This was kind of surprising, right? There's so many papers that have connected these things. So Emmanuel went and broke this down into the components. So here's what I just showed you. And this is, thinking of this plot here in the middle, is just the low-level jet, just the meridional winds. This one is just thinking about the moisture, low-level moisture.
Ross, just to quickly clarify, this is like between models.
This is all across models.
Across
Yep, we're
models.
just thinking about variability across models.
You're looking at whether these quantities are correlated with intermodal differences.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep, thank you for that question. So here, when we think about the changes across models in that low-level jet, just the winds, we find a negative correlation with precipitation across the southern Great Plains. When we look at moisture across that box, changes across models, the changes in moisture across models, there is a positive correlation. These things cancel each other out. This was kind of, this had us scratching our head as well. We thought, well, why would the low-level jet be negatively correlated with precipitation across? Because we were thinking about this in terms of the jet forcing precipitation. But we can't do this with correlations, right? We went and looked at temperature changes and that pressure gradient. And what we're really seeing is the models that dry the most here are the ones that warm the most across the southern Great Plains and are the ones that have the stronger winds in that low-level jet, right? And using these monthly averages. Everything here is monthly averages. So, in summary, we're not seeing low-level moisture flux explaining this intermodal variability in precipitation change. Okay, so we did global large scale, we did this regional circulation. Let's look at surface fluxes for local processes. What's that?
Yes.
Yes. So here are plots showing the change in Bowen ratio and evaporative fraction in these plots, and look at this bullseye. We really see very strong, in fact, we created an index for each of these across this region, and that's what's plotted in the plots on the bottom here. R values of 0.76, 0.86, really strong correlation. And this is, not terribly surprising, right? Surface flux changes strongly explain precipitation change variability across these models. But the difficulty here is the causality, right? Which thing is causing what? Which is impossible to disentangle from just these correlations. Which is why we wanted to use the PI control, right? The unforced simulations. So here is a correlation between precipitation change and unforced terrestrial coupling index. Going to that unforced PI control and thinking about what is the base atmosphere land coupling strength for each grid box, and then correlating it with what the precipitation change we see between the historical and the end of the century is. And that way we can somewhat separate, right, that we can separate out that coupling because the PI control is not is different than our historical and future simulations.
I'm sorry, what is PI control?
The PI control is a pre-industrial, unforced experiment. These are run for hundreds of years, just to get an idea of what that base variability in the model is without any sort of solar, greenhouse gas, any sort of forcing.
Okay.
All right? So what we see here is that the stronger coupling is associated with drier future projections across the southern Great Plains, right? This is kind of a bullseye here, and I've shown you for each of these different models in our ensemble where they fall in terms of this terrestrial coupling index from the PI control and the change in southern Great Plains precipitation. You get It's not the strongest relationship, but there is a clear relationship here. And he went further to think about, okay, well, what should the coupling strength be in this region? And he's using reanalyses, which would be great to have some observation, but this is going to be a real pain. We were looking at some flux tower sites. But the nice thing is that for the most part, these reanalyses all agree on what that terrestrial coupling index should be. And they are suggesting that a lot of these CMIT models underestimate that coupling strength. We did this for a couple of different of these land-atmosphere coupling indices, just to make sure that this signal was consistent. And so we are looking at the relationship between surface temperature and, this atmospheric coupling index using temperature, this atmospheric coupling index using precipitation, and this terrestrial coupling index.
Remind us what the coupling index is again.
Yes. Sorry, I should have. No worries. So our coupling index is the correlation between some, what do we call SV and TV again? So we're looking at the correlation between, say, soil moisture and precipitation multiplied by that standard deviation. Yes. So the atmospheric coupling in this is soil moisture and precipitation or temperature, and the terrestrial is soil moisture and latent heating. And we're seeing very strong signals across the southern Great Plains region. So the key point here is that we think that we have evidence to support the idea that land-atmosphere coupling is key to understanding intermodal variability in precipitation over the southern Great Plains. And what Emmanuel is going to be doing next is he has been accepted into the graduate visitor program at NCAR and is going to be working with Isla Simpson and Daniel Kennedy to mess with CESM and change the terrestrial coupling index, right? So they have an idea of how to use some of the parameters to push that terrestrial coupling index to higher and lower values. And then they're going to see if, when that is perturbed in a climate change scenario, whether the precipitation response also follows this hypothesis, right? That this terrestrial coupling index can account for this change in precipitation across the southern Great Plains. So really excited that he's going to be able to participate in that. Really excited to see what comes out of these simulations.
What is the parameter that they adjust?
Yeah,
What is their
so
precipitation
they've been
response?
doing a perturbed parameter ensembles, and there's a whole lot of parameters. That's why he's going to NCAR, because I can't tell him what those parameters are. So he's going to work with the experts at NCAR to figure out what those parameters are.
Okay.
And we have a feeling that's going to take his in his first plan for the summer was like to do this in the first week. And I said, it's probably going to take you a couple of weeks to figure out what those parameters are at the most. But they were the ones who are really going to give him good advice on which things to explore. And he'll do a lot of exploration, a lot of test runs to see which ones are the best to perturb, best to change there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning from his project as well. So this is one of the things that we do in our lab, right? One of the things I learned how to do here is to think about variability across ensembles of models and apply that to understand where that uncertainty comes from. Now, I wanted to thank you all for inviting me out for a talk. You don't often get to give a talk on Groundhog's Day.
Poor Phil.
I wanted to tell you about another project that we're working on in our group, and this is thinking about uncertainty in rain-on-snow events in numerical models. All right, this is a kind of a completely different switch, but the things that are constant here are we're thinking about uncertainty in models, and we're thinking about the central United States, okay? And so this is a Centennial 2 image of snow cover. This is March 11th in 2019. And then here, just 5 days later, the same area, all that snow is gone. And you'll note that the rivers look rather swollen. Right? Here is what those rivers in that Omaha, eastern Nebraska region look like normally in March. And here's what they looked at around the same time in March after all that snow melted. This rain-on-snow event was due to a big bomb cyclone that came through, dumped a whole lot of water on top of a rather large amount of snow. All that snow melted, dams were burst, there was all sorts of roadways that were covered in water. A really big, impactful event. In fact, I think Offutt Air Force Base is still working to repair some of the regions that were damaged in this really large flooding event. And so when I got out to Nebraska, I started chatting with people, trying to build collaborations, and someone said, hey, have you ever thought about looking at rain-on-snow events? And I said, no, I mostly think about the tropics and West Africa. And he said, you should really think about this, right? So we care about these events, and this was, 2021 was still very fresh in the minds of folks in eastern Nebraska. There's a big question about how rain-on-snow events are going to change in the future. A lot of that work has been focused on the western United States, not as much focused across the Great Plains and the eastern United States. So in order to really introduce myself to this problem and really start to get a feel for it, I said, okay, well, why don't I quickly look and think about how global models represent historical rain-on-snow distributions and change across the central Great Plains region, right? And this was just kind of exploratory work for me to get myself used to this idea of thinking about a process, a really impactful sort of event in a region. So we went and found a good definition for rain-on-snow days following Jiang and Sushama. More than 1 millimeter of precipitation falls during the day. Snow water equivalent greater than 1 millimeter, and because we don't know what kind of precipitation is falling, if the SWE, that snow water equivalent, decreases in the following day, we're going to assume that that was rain, that it was melting, right? And we applied this algorithm to a gridded observational data set called DayMet, precipitation in SWE daily from 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid spacings. And then I'm going to kind of average just across our central United States region here and show that in these profiles over here. And then I did a similar thing with just an ensemble of 23 CMEP6 models, same period. And what really kind of jumped out is that most of these models were greatly underrepresenting the number of rain-on-snow days. And we experimented a bit with this idea of comparing really coarse global models with really high-resolution DayMet. We also used a couple of other observational and reanalysis data sets, including the UA sweep product and PRISM. We used ERA5. Snow change from satellites is it's kind of a challenge. So we didn't have anything that was just purely observational. But they all showed that these CMEP models were underrepresenting these number of rain-on-snow days. And they weren't getting the trends for this period right. Of course, the trends I'm not super confident in because all of these observational or reanalysis showed very different trends as well. So I really wanted to think about, well, where are these biases coming from? And so I used the same kind of approach that I was just talking about, thinking about using different ensembles. Thinking about ensembles with fixed SSTs, thinking about separating out for resolution. Maybe resolution has an impact. So here's what that looks like, for example, with fixed SSTs. Not much change, less variability perhaps across the model ensemble, but not really much of a change in terms of the size of the bias, right? And there was no signal really thinking about resolution. We looked at this in Cortex simulations as well. Didn't really see anything. But then really started thinking about, okay, well, what's happening during a lot of these events in that region? and started thinking about, okay, well, what is the latent heat flux? What are the fluxes into the surface that are present in those rather large grid boxes during these rain-on-snow days? And we see that these models, right, that have, that there's a clear relationship between the number of rain-on-snow days in that region and the latent heat flux that happens during precipitation on snow and during these rain-on-snow events where snow melts. That there is a connection between the representation of fluxes at the surface and how frequently models produce these rain-on-snow days.
Clarification?
Yes.
So, precip on snow, that's snow on snow? How's that different?
This could be any kind of precipitation.
It's
Yes.
both rain and
Yep.
snow.
Precip on snow, and then the rain on snow is the one where sweet decreases in the next day. I just wanted to put them both on here to show those two different ways that we were looking at them. Thank you for that question. So this got us thinking about, well, how are these latent heat fluxes represented during these simulations? And so we wrote a NOAA proposal that was funded, thinking about how well rain-on-snow events are represented in numerical models. This project was done by my former postdoctoral researcher, Eric Jansen. Some of you may recognize this face. He was also a graduate student in this program. Zach Suriano was in charge of really thinking about the observational record and building a really good sort of observational record of what these fluxes are during these rain-on-snow events. And Tirthankar is my colleague in the College of Engineering who got me interested in rain-on-snow in the first place and has a lot of experience thinking about the hydrology, right? What happens after all this snow melts and this rain falls. And so we began by just taking one event, our case study of this big 2019 rain-on-snow event, and saying, hey, can we simulate this in a numerical model? So we're going to choose weather research and forecasting, WRF model. I put, all the the choices we made for running this simulation here on the left. Here's our model domain. And we're going to show you a couple of time series which we've averaged across this eastern Nebraska region where we have a flux tower, actually 3 flux towers at this Meade, Nebraska site, which we're going to use as observations of fluxes before, during, and after this event. And as you can see from an animation of the rain and snow mixing ratio from the lowest model level compared with radar from the College of DuPage, this radar loop that we got from them, you can see that our simulation produces a really reasonable looking cyclone here. Well, what does the snow melt look like? Okay, well, we got a whole bunch of different records of snow, of SWE, in this boxed region. From SNODOS in blue, ERA5 is this dashed line. We have a European, the ESA CCI is in this light green, and the no-HRST model in the black, along with in situ observations at a location it's not exactly where the flux tower is, but it's very nearby. And you can see our WRF simulation in red. One thing you might notice is that our WRF simulation doesn't start with as much snow, and it takes longer for that snow to melt than these other estimates for SWE change. I left a couple of lines off here. I left off the DayMet and the UA SWE product because they produce values that were absurdly high. And I would really have liked a much higher resolution product that would allow us to think about SWE in this region. One thing that we've been kind of experimenting with is using machine learning to think about, everyone has cameras in their backyard, and we've got cameras and over road interpasses, and there's a Platte River time lapse, all these cameras collecting data. Can we use those to get higher resolution and some machine learning? So Eric Jansen was looking at this as part of a project before he had to accept another position. But I think that's something that would really help this analysis, is that there is a big uncertainty in that snowmelt just from all these different products. But we do see that our WRF simulation starts off with a reasonable amount of snow. And that snow does melt, but it melts a bit slower than a lot of these observational estimates. As I said earlier, we produce the large-scale behavior of this event really well. We have precipitation on the top here. Our flux tower is in black. The ERA 5 reanalysis is in the red dashed lines, and our WRF simulation is in the solid red line. You can see we produce precipitation with the same timing and magnitude as what's seen in the other products. We have fluxes from ERA 5 WRF and that any one flux tower site. Here's our net radiation, latent heat, and sensible heat, with the convention that fluxes into the surface are negative, right, pointing down. And we can see that the simulation generally captures that cycle of radiation and sensible fluxes before, during, and after the event, and the latent fluxes after the event, but not during the event, right? Our WRF simulation doesn't appear to really be able to represent that latent heat flux into the surface during the rain-on-snow event. And we can also see this in our maps. So here's the latent heat flux from ERA 5. Red is negative fluxes, latent heat fluxes into the surface. And our filled blue boxes here, that's where there is snow, where there is SWE. And here's our simulation, our WRF simulation. What you'll notice is that those negative latent heat fluxes come right up to the snow edge and stop, like right there at the snow edge. This is troubling. And not only, we kind of thought, well, maybe we did something dumb in setting up our WRF simulation, right? There's a lot of things you have to account for when you set up these simulations. Let's look at another set of simulations, which a lot of really, really smart people worked on, CONUS 404. CONUS 404 shows the exact same thing, where those negative fluxes go right up to the edge of where the snow is and stop. Okay. But who cares, right? Latent heat fluxes, how important is this? So we wanted to think about that impact of those latent heat fluxes. And so I ran a simple snowmelt model where I just forced the snowmelt model with the fluxes from the NE1 tower site. And so that is this red line, this red curve here. It's covered up by the blue one for most of it. But here you can see this is that snowmelt model with all of those fluxes. And then I went through and decreased the amount of latent heat flux by 10% each time to see how much longer that would take that snow to melt. And when all of those latent heat fluxes are removed, that snow takes 10 additional hours to melt around 40 millimeters of SWE. That's 20% longer, right? Which has a big impact on runoff. So I'm a snow modeler now and also a runoff modeler. Got a simple runoff model from Marmot. I can't remember what Marmot stands for. It's a modular toolbox for runoff. And used a very idealized runoff model, but that's, right, thinking about as we decrease that latent heat flux that's into the snowpack, the runoff peaks lower, and it takes a longer time for it to peak. That there is a big impact just from removing these latent heat fluxes. So Eric, this all was in we just published this last week in Environmental Research Letters. Of course, one day at AMS after we gave talks on this, it would have been great to have been able to say this has been accepted, but sometimes that's just the timing. So Eric took this and said, hey, how can we think about improving that representation of latent heat flux in these simulations? And so he went through and really thought about, okay, well, how is latent heat flux computed in these numerical models, right? So here's latent heat flux is a coefficient for latent heat times this surface to the near surface air moisture gradient. And this coefficient for latent heat depends on resistance to heat transfer or surface roughness, and also resistance to evaporation. A lot of these models use Sakaguchi and Zeng from 2009, but this is really optimized for summer conditions. So there's another option in WRF where you can change that resistance to evaporation to decrease it over a snowpack. So he made these fun sketches. We were sketching these on the board, and he put them into a PowerPoint for a presentation. So in thinking about this resistance to heat transfer, right? If we have smooth snow and low roughness, we're going to have, some amount of flux. But if we have a larger amount of roughness, right, more turbulence, a larger amount of flux. And so in his simulations, he went through and changed it from the default of 0.002 meters to 0.02 meters, right? Really a whole order of magnitude. Increase this snow, this surface roughness, thinking about rough snow. We'll see if that has an impact. The other thing was the surface resistance to evaporation. All right, so here, normally we think about this as being symmetric. The resistance to a flux of energy into the surface is going to be the same going in and going out. And in the Sakaguchi and Zeng paper, this is set to 1,000 Siemens per meter. This is an incredibly large number, right? And this is optimized for summer months. It's not really optimized for thinking about over a snow surface. So if we change the flags in WRF, we can reduce that to 50 Siemens per meter. All right, so this is going to be RSF4. This is still symmetric for fluxes into and out of the surface. But does that really make sense? If you have a large amount of moisture above a snow surface, why should there be a large resistance to it just condensing on that surface? So we went further and said, okay, if you're above snow and you've got a strong moisture gradient, we reduce that resistance to 0.5 Siemens per meter. And so these are the experiments we're going to explore in our WRF simulations. At this point, we're thinking about not just our Great Plains case study, but adding a couple of additional ones just to make sure that we haven't picked one event that is different than others. So we're also looking at an event in the Connecticut Valley from 2009 and the Ohio River Valley in 2013. And so in these columns, we've got the standard SC 2009 on the right. Sorry, the left. We've got our high resistance with RSF equal to 4 in the middle, and our low resistance, evaporative resistance, on the right. So this is thinking about a really large resistance over snow, right? You're not going to get these fluxes into the surface if you have 1,000 Siemens per meter resistance for that flux. Things are better when we reduce them to 50 Siemens per meter. We're starting to get some of these negative fluxes into the snow. And then finally, for fluxes that are into the surface, we reduce this to 0.5 Siemens per meter. And we're really able to see strong downward latent heat fluxes over the snow cover.
Sorry, so this is resistance to condensation at the surface?
Yep.
Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And another way we looked at this is just by looking at cumulative distribution functions over all snow grid cells and non-snow grid cells to make sure that when we're changing this, we are really changing these distributions. So the thick black line is AR5. Our WRF control is in this light blue solid line. And as we change this evaporative resistance, we are able to get stronger and stronger values over the snow, and we're not changing very much over the non-snow, which is also important because we don't want to change anything where there is not snow, right? This is showing this for our surface roughness, showing that even when changed by an order of magnitude, there really aren't changes in these latent heat fluxes. This is not having a big impact on our simulations. So this resistance to evaporation is really critical for representing these negative heat fluxes into, these negative latent heat fluxes into the snow surface. One other thing we would like to look at is that surface to air moisture gradient, right? We haven't thought of exactly how to tweak this yet or how to improve it, but Eric was able to think of a way to just artificially decrease it so you get a stronger gradient. And once you do that, you get really nice looking fluxes, which agree really well with Era 5 and the flux tower data. So increasing that moisture gradient boosts those latent heat fluxes. We're still thinking about how to do this without artificially just increasing it. And this has a really large impact on snow melt. Increased latent heat into the snowpack, more snow melt in the model, more runoff. This has implications for forecasting the flooding and runoff associated with these rain-on-snow events. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about, and I'm running out of time here, but I just wanted to maybe give you a teaser of this. I might skip through some of this. But where we want to think about this next is where and when do latent heat fluxes be the most, where are they the most important during rain-on-snow events? Is it for all rain-on-snow events, just rain events in certain regions and certain times? And I've been thinking, maybe we can connect this to atmospheric rivers. There have been a bunch of previous studies that have connected atmospheric rivers to rain-on-snow events, looking specifically at certain regions. So a question I have is, are there understudied regions where these rain-on-snow events and atmospheric rivers are connected? And so I just started working on this a couple weeks ago. Found a good atmospheric river. I'm using Era 5 reanalysis data, 6-hourly data. I have a rain-on-snow detection algorithm thinking about positive snow melt in that 6-hour window. We can increase that threshold to think about more and more extreme events. And I need to have precipitation larger than 1 millimeter per hour during that same period. And then for the atmospheric river detection, I'm using Target version 3, implemented for Era 5 by Rupingmo. And so here's an example of this for that 2019 event, right? The red outline are these atmospheric rivers. The blue points are where we have a rain-on-snow event, and yellow is just where snow is melting without precipitation being recognized. And so here's a map of where the fraction of rain-on-snow events within an atmospheric river. So this is for any event that has snow melt larger than 0.0 millimeters per hour. It's not super interesting. But as we increase that threshold and think about melting of 0.5 millimeters per hour or even 1 millimeter per hour, we're starting to see some regions where most of those really intense rain-on-snow events are associated with those atmospheric rivers. Of course, some areas which are not going to be surprising to you, the West Coast, Greenland, regions with strong topography, but there are a couple of regions which really leap out that people haven't looked so closely at. For example, the eastern part of the United States and Canada, and this region here of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, which showed this to a couple of colleagues, and they said, well, I didn't really expect that region to, to have that signal. So some of these regions are well studied and some are not. How do surface fluxes differ between these rain-on-snow events that occur inside and outside of atmospheric rivers? And so I looked at this here's our stronger snowmelt case of 1 millimeter per hour. The blue, this histogram in the blue, which is behind is without rain-on-snow events that do not have an atmospheric river. And the orange ones are with ones. So you can see that the largest, the latent heat flux into the surface is larger for rain-on snow events during an atmospheric river. We're really trying to think about when do we care about this process, which we've shown is not well represented in these WRF simulations. So we're writing this up. All right, so in summary, land-atmosphere coupling helps us understand uncertainty and projections of summer precipitation across the Great Plains. My group does a lot of CMEP analysis, thinking about these large ensembles and understanding uncertainty in those projections. And then improving the representation of latent heat fluxes in numerical simulations of rain-on-snow events allows us to better represent that flooding and rain and runoff. So this is, my group does a lot of CMEP analysis. We do a lot of experiments, right? A lot of model perturbation experiments, thinking about deficiencies in models and how to improve them. And I didn't do very much land-atmosphere interaction stuff when I was here in Wisconsin. Right? Dan was my advisor, thought about atmosphere-ocean coupling and large-scale dynamics. But really, the education I got here, the fundamental think, how to use models, how to think about data, how to ask good questions, came from what I learned here. And that has been able to be applied to a lot of really interesting and challenging questions. That's why, one of the reasons why I wanted to share with you some of these stuff that perhaps I wasn't an expert in when I left Madison. But I'm always interested in new collaborations and would be glad to take a couple of questions.
Thanks, Ross. I think usually we start with questions from the students, and then we'll open it up to questions in general. So I'll let...
Yes, go ahead, Ian.
Thanks for the great talk. I believe your motivation for the rain on snow research was misrepresentation of rain on snow days in CMIP models. And I'm wondering how much of that is chalked up to these different models undercounting how much precipitation there is, or the representation of how much snowpack there is on the ground, and how does that compare to the results you showed were late heating and the representation of the disease?
Yeah, so the CMUP analysis for rain on snow, we didn't pursue this. As you noticed, I haven't even submitted this to something. This was mostly me just exploring, right? Me getting used to what are these definitions, how do I think about this problem? I agree that I think that there's a possibility that there's a lot of, these models have very low resolutions, right? And trying to think about something like rain on snow, which is a very high resolution sort of process, you have to be very careful. So I agree that I think, yeah, I haven't looked at that, but this is one of the reasons why we didn't really push forward with that. But it really kind of informed what we might be thinking about in terms of exploring in a different manner. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hey Ross, thanks for a great presentation. I have a question from your first half of the talk. So when you showed the coupling strength from pre-control or pre-industrial control to the changes in precipitation in the future, do you see the same results if you compare the coupling strength with the pre-industrial control of the same model, or is it different?
Yes, so, right, because this is, right, I mean, we don't really have any sort of observational constraint, right? And Emmanuel really wanted to do something with some sort of constraint. We'll see. He's about to submit this paper. It's sitting on my desk for a final final go through. I feel really bad because I've been sitting on it for a couple weeks now. It's been a crazy couple of weeks. But yes, that is something that we were thinking about, is that observational, right? Because that's from the historical period. We don't have, a really good observational or even real analysis sort of constraint for the unforced period. But he has gone through and correlated these, and they do correlate.
So they look the same?
They're not the same, but there is a correlation. I don't remember how strong it was, but it was fairly strong. But that's a great question. Thank you. Yes?
I wanted to ask another, just like two real basic questions about this half of the talk. Is that, first one is just, is it common to, look to do regional analysis with, you know, a global level climate model. And then secondly, just from my like real beginner modeling of like precipitation, it's in the CESM modeling that I do, precipitation is a really noisy field, and so I've had better look at, or better luck looking at variables like cloud liquid water content and cloud water concentration to make inferences about precipitation. Has Emmanuel or you looked at that at all?
Now that second part, definitely, we have not. We have really been just focusing on precipitation. The first bit is very interesting, right? We want to think about this regionally. Why are we using a global model, right? And it's due to the fact that we want to take into account the fully coupled, right, and Earth system. And think about how all of those different feedbacks across the entire Earth system have an impact on that local precipitation. To me, that's where it all starts, right? And you could do some sort of statistical or dynamical downscaling to perhaps get higher resolution or to better represent extremes. But for us, we just want to think about, in those global models, how do we explain this, right? How do we explain this large disagreement between these simulations? So, thank you. Does that help?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you. Yes?
Hi, Ross. Very interesting talk, especially the rain and snow events. And you mentioned collaborating a lot. Are there plans or are there existing intensive field campaigns that look at rain measurements, snow measurements?
Yes, so I've had a couple conversations with colleagues. Andrew Winters, who also got his degree from this program, came out and gave a talk at UNL a year and a half or so ago. And we had some good conversations of what sort of data came out of some of the field campaigns he was involved in. Haven't really gotten deeper into that. We would like to follow up this NOAA proposal with another proposal, but things have been a bit crazy for me in the last several months. So, but that's a great point. Thank you. Yes.
Just another question that came to mind. When you showed the time series of precipitation for your case event for rain and snow, there was a little blip previously where there was precipitation and observations, but the model wasn't able to capture that. I'm wondering how much does the effect of these swelling streams and greater potential for late viewing encourage repeat rain on snow events to amplify the effects of it?
Yeah, so that was something that a reviewer picked out and said, yeah, look, there's this little blip here, but it's not really shown in Air 5 or a WRF, like what's going on with that? Precipitation is just, is extremely complicated, right? And I didn't want to look, if these things had all fallen over here, I would be thinking about, well, what happened in the simulation? But this wasn't as concerning to me, but it is something to notice. Thank you for that question. Yes, go ahead.
In the rain on snow part of the presentation, particularly with the definition of rain on snow, something that was coming to mind for me based off an observation of an event here maybe a month ago, where we had snow on the ground and it was raining, but it doesn't seem as if there was a whole lot of melting because the actual air temperature is very close to freezing and it had been very cold beforehand. Are there times where the snow water equivalent actually increases because of rain on the snowpack?
Yeah, I think this is especially something that is of concern in the high latitudes, right? Which I haven't thought too much about. I've been really focused on these mid-latitude sort of events. But there are a lot of definitions. And we have explored a lot of the different thresholds to think about whether we're thinking about this in terms of daily, rain on snow days, what are those daily conditions? When we really went to break down into fluxes, we realized that using that day definition wasn't going to be good enough because often you have really high fluxes outside of the actual precipitation event, right? And so this is why we moved into those 6-hourly sort of windows. And Zach Suriano is doing a lot of this work thinking about the observational and reanalysis approach to these different fluxes. But that's a really good point about making sure that we think about critically what our definitions of the events are. Yeah.
this is a real priority for the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers as well. There are some efforts at looking at this and looking at hydrological flooding. These more warm climate rain on snow events have an enormous impact in there around here as well. And with changing climate, we start to see this. So it's really interesting to see that sort of fundamental process of the lake reflux.
Yeah, when I first got into this, I was like, oh, this doesn't sound very interesting. It's just rain falls on snow, the snow melts. Like, how complicated can this be? And it ends up that there's a lot of nuance here, right?
All right, let's, Brad, and then let's, one more question.
You had one of your figures where you were looking at the moisture transport. On each coast, there was a strong anti-correlation. Is that tied to stationary planetary waves? Where do you think that's from?
That's a great question. I really need to step back and think about,
It's an interesting feature.
It is interesting. First things first, but that definitely did hop into my mind.
I'm just imagining, a trough and a big ridge over the center part.
Yeah. That's and that could have a very strong connection with the feature that we're very interested in.
Yeah.
So that's a really great point. Thanks, Brad.
All right, let's thank Ross once again for.
Thank you.